It's pretty crazy to think we're almost in December already. There are no more rackets coming out this year. 2025 is going to bring some awesome new stuff. But first, let's take a look at the best racket releases of the year. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. Now I always love making our annual top 5 best rackets video because it's a great way to reflect on what's come out over the course of the year. Now I also know it can be pretty polarizing, especially if your racket doesn't make the list, so I apologize if I offend anyone, but just remember this is my personal opinion. Just because your racket doesn't make it doesn't mean it's a bad racket by any stretch of the imagination. Now of course, as usual, let me remind you that any of the rackets we talk about here today you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me and the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So I am going to go over some criteria here in a second, but first I do need to give you guys a little update on an unfortunate situation I found myself in. I think you've all seen the ankle brace I've been wearing in a lot of recent videos. That injury recovery is not going very well. I initially hurt my ankle last year and then started feeling quite a bit of recurring pain earlier this year. Now I've been able to kind of work my way around that pain when playtesting, but that flared up pretty badly a couple of weeks ago. I got an MRI, I met with an orthopedic surgeon. I'm going to go through some pretty strict rehab for the next couple of months, but I may need surgery in the future if it doesn't get better. Right now, I can't really put any lateral pressure on my right ankle, so I'm probably going to have to step off the court for a little while, which means I will need to problem solve for these January reviews, but I promise I'll keep you guys in the loop as the situation progresses. It is kind of a tough period for me. Injuries are not fun, but making these videos does give me a lot to look forward to, so I'll try my best to keep the content flowing, even if it is a little bit different here and there. But enough about that, I'll be fine. Let's talk about some criteria, starting with number 1. Again, this is my personal opinion. I try to be as objective as possible, but my own personal biases will always come through, so please don't hesitate to let me know in the comment section if you think I'm totally wrong. 2, only rackets that came out this year are up for consideration, and no, limited editions are not new rackets. I'm talking rackets like the 30th anniversary Pure Drives, the Black E-Zone, the Cream V-Cores. Those aren't actually new frames, and of course, we also need to carry these rackets at the store. The last piece of criteria is that I'm not going to repeat a different version of a racket if there's no difference in the actual mold. For example, the Blade 1820 and 1619 are identical other than string pattern, so I wouldn't put the Blade 1820 at 2 and the Blade 1619 at 1. Same with the Speed MP and Speed Pro. I know those are a little more different, but not enough to justify me putting them both on the list. Now, for example, the Blade 98 and the Blade 100 could both make the list. Those two rackets are drastically different with different head sizes and different molds. That's it for the criteria. Knowing me, this video could end up being way too long, so let's dive right into number 5. I was really hesitating between 2 rackets to make up this 5th spot. I do think there's a pretty clear gap between 4 and 5 and then the top 3, but coming in at number 5, we have the Head Extreme Pro. For anyone who's still confused by the name here, this used to be known as the Head Extreme Tour, but they scrapped the 315 gram 100 square inch Extreme, which used to be the Pro, then renamed this one the Pro. This is the 98 305. So this racket takes the 5th spot, in part because the Auxetic 2.0 updates have improved it. It feels a little more solid, a little more stable, and I don't think it needs quite as much customization as it did previously. That's great, but more importantly, Head kept the Extreme Tour design and DNA, which is a very good thing because this is a racket that does a lot of things well and that a lot of people have loved since it was first introduced. It's obviously first and foremost a spin racket. It's got plenty of spin tech like the spin grommets, the fairly open 16x19 string pattern, and the aerodynamic design, but it's also a 98, so it has a really solid element of control to it. You get quite a bit of feel and precision, and because of that, unlike the Extreme MP, which you need to use spin to control, you get a lot more variety with this racket. That variety works very well in the hands of a high-level modern player because it complements their naturally spin-friendly style, but it also rewards them for playing a more all-court game. It belongs to a category of rackets that I like to call modern players rackets, like the V-Core 98, E-Zone 98, and of course the extremely popular Aero 98. It doesn't have quite as high of a playability ceiling as the Aero does, but it is easier to use, especially with this Auxetic 2.0 update. That's also why I have it coming in ahead of the Boom Pro, which isn't going to make the top 5. I find that Auxetic 2.0 has helped improve this frame more than it did the Boom. The previous Boom was already very solid, stable, and it had a smooth flex. the Extreme Tour to me was always a little bit jarring, and that's what Auxetic 2.0 has done a good job with. It just smooths it out a little bit to make it a more user-friendly racket overall. Coming in at number 4, we have the Wilson Blade 98 V9, either the 1820 or the 1619. Go for the 1820 if you want the best control that this line can offer, and go for the 16x19 if you want a little bit more spin and just a little more variety as well. Now the Blade at 4 hurts me a little bit. This is a racket I wish I could place higher. It should be higher, but I just don't think it deserves to be in the top 3 conversation for a couple of reasons. For one, ever since the V6, the Blade has lost a little bit of that magical feel that made it so special to begin with. It's always felt a little more modern than true control rackets, but they've really been overly altering that feel over the last several generations. The V6 was quite muted, then they started implementing the clashes technology into the layup, making the 7 and the 8 a little mushy, and that's still kind of the case on the V9, although I do think they've made some noticeable improvements. You do have a little more ball feel here. Wilson marketed that they had sharpened up the Blade, which I do agree with to a certain extent, but you do still get a little bit of that artificial feel on contact. Now the thing is, I can keep living in the past with the Blade, and I probably will, but the reality is that this tech certainly does make it more user-friendly, which is what they're going for. I completely understand it from a marketing point of view because that's kind of the direction the industry is heading right now. And in terms of performance, I do have to say, this amount of control and this forgiving of a racket actually works quite well. That opens it up to a wider variety of players. So if you prioritize control but don't want something that's too demanding, this is one of the best rackets for that right now. It's also still a Blade, so it's quick and maneuverable, quite spin friendly, and also very comfortable as you would expect from a control racket. And I have to say, I do like the changes they've made. Like I said, the feel is slowly getting better, they're evolving that stabilization tech, and they also made it stiffer, which is why it's not quite as mushy. I also like that they raised the swing weight, which makes it a bit more solid and gives it pretty good plow through. I just think it's not a 2015 Blade, but it is a little bit more Blade than it has been recently, and that's a solid development. So from an objective point of view, this is a very good racket, but like I said, there's still some personal bias, so it's not going any higher than number 4. Okay, so like I said, 4 and 5 I consider very good rackets, but the top 3 are pretty clearly a cut above the rest. I've struggled big time with this decision, but coming in at number 3, I have the Head Speed MP. Oh, and by the way, the Legend MP and the Speed MP are identical, so I'm talking about that one too. But anyways, this is a wonderful racket. I could have put it second or first, and really, in a lot of ways, 2024 has kind of been the year of the Speed for me. I haven't always taken this line seriously, mainly because I considered it to be too jack-of-all-tradesy. I'm not usually a fan of these super well-rounded 100s, but if you're going to do jack-of-all-trades, this is how. The Speed could easily be in the top 5 spin rackets. It's also very powerful. It wouldn't crack a top 5 control rackets list, but it's super consistent considering how powerful and spin friendly it is. It's also stable, comfortable, and has quite an addictive feel, and all those things make it a racket that's really fun to use and performs very well all around the court. The fact that it's 100 square inches and only weighs 300 grams means that it's very user-friendly, and user-friendly combined with everything else I just said basically means this is a racket that makes playing good tennis just a little bit easier. That's also why I've got it ahead of the Speed Pro, by the way. Everything about that racket is just a little bit harder than the MP. It's heavier, it's slower, it's maybe a little bit more controlled, but it makes you work a lot harder to use it effectively, which is why I think this is a better overall racket. Now let's talk about what's changed on this version, because that is an important part of determining this top 5. Head has added Auxetic 2.0 here, which, like the Extreme Pro, makes it a little bit more solid, also a little more muted, and they raised the swing weight. Now, it's tough to say that those changes have point blank improved this racket the way they did on the Extreme Pro, especially that bump in swing weight, which certainly helps to make it more consistent and stable, but it also makes it quite a bit slower. Part of the Speed's magic is that it is supposed to be maneuverable so that you can move efficiently around the court, and while it's definitely more sluggish than the last one, it's still not a slow racket by any stretch of the imagination. We're talking mid 320s swing weight here. This isn't an RF 97, so it's definitely manageable, but I know some players would have preferred it a little lower. Also, making it more muted isn't everyone's cup of tea. Now, you guys know how much I like good feel, and it hasn't bothered me too much here, but that is a small price you pay for that slightly higher stability you get with Auxetic 2.0. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that this isn't necessarily a huge improvement on the previous Speed, which isn't a big deal. That was already an awesome racket, but that is why I've decided to put it third instead of second. Second place is a pretty noticeable improvement on the racket it replaces, although having said that, they definitely haven't reinvented the wheel either. Coming in at number 2, we have the Babolat Pure Strike 98. Now, it had pretty much been 5 years since the last Pure Strike came out, so I hadn't really played with the previous one that much, at least not since I started reviewing. And this racket reminded me just how good the Pure Strike actually is. Obviously, this is Babolat's control line. It has a thin beam, it comes in an 1820, and even the 1619 has a pretty dense pattern, so the launch angle is lower than their other rackets. With that said, because of the way the beam is shaped to be thicker in the bottom portion of the hoop, and because the swing weight is quite high, the amount of power you can generate here is off the charts. Yes, it takes quite a fast and full swing to get it moving because of that swing weight, but when you do, its power is competitive with actual power rackets and way more than, say, a Blade, a Percept, or a Prestige. And this is true for both the 18x20 and 1619, by the way. Just go for the 1820 if you want more flat control, and the 1619 if you play a more spinny style. So it is kind of similar to the Speed in that this amount of power and variety with this much consistency is really what separates it from a lot of other rackets in the industry. The reason I have it higher is because the actual improvements here coming from the previous Strike are much more obvious than they are on the Speed. The previous Strike was very raw, which some people liked, but that also made it a little jarring and slightly uncomfortable. Babolat added their NF2 Tech flak inserts to the layup and lowered the flex, which softened it up and pretty much solved all those problems. The comfort issues are no longer really there, and you just get a bit more of a plush feel on contact, which helps with control and connection to the ball, and it helps make it a little more consistent. This update really is a perfect example of technology that works rather than over-engineering a frame. They addressed the previous one's small issues without going too far. But yeah, I think maybe the Strike flies under the radar a little bit, and to be fair, it's not one of those modern control rackets that's made to be super user-friendly like the Blade. It is pretty demanding, which makes it kind of exclusive to higher level players, but if it works for you, you'll know it is a special racket. I know Beckett has it as his racket of the year. I was very close to doing the same, and I know all you Pure Strike lovers are probably there thinking, yeah, Luca, we've been telling you this, but there you go, I'm finally on the bandwagon. At this point, you probably know what's coming, and yes, despite this racket being very polarizing, with some people telling me it's absolutely awful, I'm sticking to it. Coming in at number 1, we have the Wilson RF01, Pro or Standard, whichever one works better for you, they're both great. Now, I understand why some people don't like this racket. It doesn't play anything like a Pro Staff, and obviously the comparisons are going to happen because of who's endorsing it, and really, it doesn't compare to that many rackets in terms of modern playability elements. That's because there's really no modern tech in here. Wilson went as raw as they could with the layup, so there's none of that easy stability that we see in the Blade, and because people are getting used to that, I can see why it would be a bit odd at first. It's not a very forgiving racket. In fact, I'll go as far as to say it's pretty punishing. The sweet spot is small, and if you want to make it bigger, you're going to have to add lead at the 3 and 9 o'clock positions. Obviously, that'll make it tougher to use, but that's kind of how things work with rackets that don't have technology. There's nothing artificial going on in here, so no tech means you live by the sword, you die by the sword. The beauty behind that lack of technology is that the RF01 provides some of the most pure ball feel you can get right now. There are maybe like 2 other rackets that provide this amount of addictive feedback nowadays. Feel is sometimes overlooked because it's harder to market than power and spin, but good feel can be the difference between being totally dialed into your racket and being somewhat lost in the sweet spot. This is the type of racket you're dialed into 100%. Now, good feel is all good and well, but that's not enough to make a good racket. What's the actual point of this thing? Because at first I thought maybe it was just a cash grab with the Federer name, but that's definitely not the case. The RF01 line provides some of the most unique playability you can find right now. All of the design elements here make it one of the best rackets for playing an offensive attacking style. It has a 16x19 string pattern with a beam that's designed to move quickly through the air, so you get a lot of spin, but it's also quite a thin beam with the firm flex that has, like I keep saying, really good feel, so the directional control is fantastic. It was designed to take the ball early, dictate points with point and shoot directional control, using spin of course, because that's such a key element of the modern game. It does have some flaws. It's not made for a soft, methodical control game. It has quite a high launch angle, and because it's stiffer and the beam is non-constant, it can be a little wild when you try to slow things down. It's an all-out offensive racket that does sacrifice other game styles to make it perform so well at that particular one, and because of that, I consider it the best racket if that's the playability you're looking for. That's also a big part of the reason for why it has been so polarizing. Those of you whose game style it suits have absolutely fallen in love with it, And those of you who don't play that style, understandably, don't like it at all. In fact, I've got it at number 1 because I'm so impressed with what they've achieved here, but it's not a racket that I could switch to myself. Sometimes you just gotta put your hands up and say, wow, you really knocked it out of the park. And the reason I've got it ahead of the Speed and the Strike is because obviously this is the first of its kind, and that novelty factor has it a little bit higher for me. That said, all 3 of these rackets are excellent and could easily have been number 1. In fact, don't look at this list and see RF01 first, well, I gotta go for that racket. This is probably the one that's going to work for the least amount of you out there, so do be a little bit careful with that. With that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of these rackets, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.